The modern BDS movement, which stands for Boycott, Disinvestment and Sanctions, actually started at a human rights conference just over 10 years ago in Durban, South Africa, 2002 if I'm not mistaken, where a lot of the extreme left-wing, radical, or what they call themselves sometimes progressive, which to me always means moving back, movements decided they had to highlight a specific action item that would not seemingly attack Israel, but attack what they thought was wrong with Israel, its administration of the biblical homeland of Judea and Samaria. To do that, they picked up what was very active and good for South Africa over 30 years ago, the boycott movement. Don't buy, don't purchase, don't invest. And this began to pick up steam, and it began to develop in a sense of complete disconnect with the facts on the ground. And it became not a BDS movement, but what I call a D movement, demonization. People do not know the facts, people do not get the facts. It's a wave across campuses, it's a wave across churches, institutions, modern media, reporters are infected by it. It seems to be the thing to do, and once it reaches that level of in vogue, you don't really relate to it as parts. You see it as a big whole, and it sounds okay. This is moved unfairly through international organizations, including the United Nations, the EU. It's very discriminatory because if they had a legal leg to stand on, there are other so-called occupations or illegal settlements around the world. For example, Cyprus, Tibet, Western Sahara and other places, which they don't deal with. So obviously it's more Israel-oriented, and too much, in my opinion, is moving into the anti-Jewish field, in which students on campuses are being threatened not because they're pro-Israel or pro-Zionist, but because they're Jewish. And I think this is one of the major dangers of the BDS. Let's not forget that BDS has a history. I'm not only talking about, for example, the Jewish boycott that Hitler started already, painting things on the windows of stores, having his stormtroopers standing outside, and then slowly but surely, or even quickly, getting violent, and not only a simple a protest movement. But many people don't realize that in 1945, the Arab League, 3 years before Israel was created, met in conference and declared a boycott of the state of Israel that continued basically until 1967 and a little bit further on. The United States, for example, has laws against this boycott. Why these laws are not being applied to the current BDS movement, that's another question that I think that needs a little bit of attention. But it moves into the area, when I'm talking about boycott and other things like that, into targeting people, places, industries that in many cases are making a tremendous contribution to civilization, to science, to industry, to health care, to welfare care. And in my opinion, as a person living across the Green Line in a community called Shiloh, we are living in the ancient Jewish homeland. We are doing nothing wrong in being home. And I think that this is one aspect of the BDS which certainly has to be pointed out and fought. Well, one example that I can give you that is delegitimization unfairly is the claim, for example, that Gaza is still occupied by Israel, and therefore anything to do with Gaza and Israel should be punished. Israel does not rule Gaza. It controls a security fence to prevent terrorists from coming in, and at times has to act across the fence in order to make sure that our civilian population is not attacked. On the other hand, though, Egypt also controls its part of the security fence on the south by what we call the Rafah salient. Has anybody heard of a BDS movement against Egypt? If the subject is an illegal operation run by colonial imperialist powers that are controlling so-called Palestinian territory, there are other countries that are doing so. Why is only Israel up on the BDS focus on their screen? Why are we, Israel, the only target? I can give you multiple examples of this type of activity. We have, for example, health services in Judea and Samaria that pick up accident victims no matter who they are, what color, what nationality, etc. Do they want us to stop that? Because we shouldn't be involved in the local population? Where do you want to draw the line on BDS? Where do you want to say that we know what the target is? And of course, as we've seen over the years, over the past basically close to 15 years now, 13, 15 years, it's broad brushing Israel entirely, and any Jewish person who supports the state of Israel is being also targeted. And it rolls out of the campus. It can even attack synagogues and Daubins we see once again that we saw over 70, 75 years ago. Once you get into a hate campaign, unfortunately, there are no borders. It'll move very quickly into verbal violence, physical violence on institutions, and then injuries and worse. I cannot escape the feeling that the Jews are viewed as different. The most ultimate different person or country, in talking about Israel, or people when we talk about the Jewish people. There are too many centuries of irrational hate, irrational conceptions, conspiracy theories, and it just is pent up and is looking for an outlet. And once you open up a window and say, look what they're doing to these poor people, look what you're doing to refugees, you're stealing land, making outrageous claims that have no basis in fact. Ignore whatever went before 1967 when Israel first walked into those areas. Why? Because something called the PLO was busy blowing up houses and killing Jews where there was no occupation. The war broke out. We didn't have a single settlement in Judea, Samaria, and then and previously Gaza before 1967. So why did the Arabs get involved in the terror campaign? Maybe they should be the ones who are an object, a true object of BDS, in order to obtain peace. So I also think it's, of course, it's a zeitgeist. You know, the time, the mood of what's going on. This is what's in. I'm old enough to see at least 2 generations of children come through colleges and stuff like that, and whatever goes. They want to be who they are. It's happened also 100 years ago. Let's not blame modern kids. This is the way people are. They move into, when I was growing up in the 1960s, it was something called radical chic, or radical chic, in which you sponsored Black Panthers, even though they were the most violent element of a society. You were seen with them. College kids who have, especially in the United States, who have, in my opinion, have it very easy in terms of no threats to their lives, no problems in terms of security, relatively speaking, a long history of human rights activity across the world, from Peace Corps to Christian work services, everything like that. And they look for something that's portrayed to them as downtrodden, as suffering, as an oppressed people. And without looking too far, the issue of the Arab-Israel conflict is minuted into, we are being oppressed unfairly, illegally. They don't look for the facts. It's difficult to go through dozens of pages of legal documents to find out what's happening, and poof, they're off. Sitting down in next to the chancellor's office, or marking doorroom doors of Jews a Zionist lives here or something like that. That's very scary. But they don't see it that way. And unfortunately, a large, deep, incisive educational campaign has to be launched in order to make sure that the facts get out. In the United Nations, Israel is facing a stacked deck. When you have a Human Rights Council, for example, that has members that consistently vote anti-Israel resolutions, but worse are themselves some of the worst abusers of human rights in history. If you had a case in a court, you wouldn't want your jury to be so stacked. You would feel it very unfair. Israel is facing the same situation. In fact, one speech is repeated about 20 times at any of their sessions in Geneva or other places. The United Nations itself opened itself up to about a 200 member nation at the present moment in the General Assembly. Israel has never been allowed on any of the higher executive bodies. It's always been voted down and out. When you walk the halls and corridors of the United Nations, whether in New York or in Europe, you cannot be pro-Israel. It just doesn't, you can't sit down to a cup of coffee with another diplomat. If you're invited pro forma to one of the ambassadors' meals or some sort of get together, even in a social fashion, you will feel completely out of line. And therefore, once we're in a minority, the majority grows stronger. It grows more abusive. It grows more sure of itself. It feels it has unlimited power. And as we know, unlimited power, unchecked power can be very dangerous. You want to have scientific cooperation with other countries. You want to have agricultural cooperation, sports, cultural activities. If all of a sudden a group of nations like the Islamic nations or the Arab states, which control 20, 30, 40 seats, or votes, whatever you want to call it, if they're angry at you, you're out. Most nations of the world look around and say, Israel? And if I may add, the Jews? Oh, okay, we can do without them. We don't have to get involved. Who has more oil? So David Ben Gurion, famously said, I'll say it in Hebrew, shmum, as if the United Nations is nothing. In other words, we have to get along. We do our best, even though we are part of that forum and other international forums. We have to make our case. But we continue to do what we think is right, what we think our tradition, what the original conception of the League of Nations, which was before the United Nations, that said, we have the right to reconstitute our national homeland. Reconstitute, not create it anew, but to bring it up out of the ashes then before the Holocaust. We had a state, we had a commonwealth, we had a kingdom. Our princes and kings and prophets walked and talked this land way before many other peoples got their act together in Europe, South America, and other places like that. We have a place in this world. If BDS wants to take us out of that place, we will fight back very strongly. First of all, when we're talking about UNRWA, United Nations Relief and Works Organization, and its assistance to refugees, we have to realize that they are unique in the world because there's a general refugee body in the United Nations, and then there's UNRWA. The only group of people that has its own refugee with a different budget, with a different operation, different administration, are the Arabs who were resident of the Palestine Mandate. And secondly, the right to be a refugee, not only is it passed on, I presume by the 5th generation already by now, okay, but the right to be called a refugee of Palestine was declared to be a 2-year residency period. In other words, Jews who had hundreds of years of residency, not only in what we call the State of Israel, but also in Judea, Samaria, and Gaza throughout history, have no rights whatsoever. But an Arab from Lebanon or Syria, who during World War II, when the industry here with the British Army was heavy and very fruitful in terms of financial remuneration, they moved here and they started to stay here. 48 came, they left. They are a refugee only for 2 years. And it's passed on now for 60-something years. Thirdly, UNRWA has become the highest employment of Hamas terrorists when they're not doing terrorism. And the other part of that is that the wives or sisters or daughters of Hamas and sometimes Fatah terrorists are the teachers, the kindergarten and nursery assistants that are there. And you can obtain films that have been done recently of interviews with these people, the right of return, all sorts of the worst type of propaganda going on. It's not education, it's worse what's going on there. And so you get out of an UNRWA school and then Hamas has to you a terror camp during the summer for you. So they have 2,000 to 3,000 kids having military training straight from one institution to another. In this sense, it's the worst possible help, in quotation marks, that the UN can provide for people who are suffering to a certain extent, but basically because of the problems that either they, their fathers, or their grandfathers made in not coming to terms with what is Israel, United Nations resolutions, or League of Nations resolutions earlier on. First of all, let's get to this word or term of occupation. You and I right now are occupying ourselves talking to one another. I am occupying the seat. My professional occupation is educational resourcing. There's nothing wrong in occupation per se. It's why were you occupying? We occupied Judea and Samaria because for 2 years previously, the Arafat-led PLO was engaged in terror, which tripped the wire for the Arab states to have a second round. They closed the states of Tehran. The Hashemite king Hussein opened up fire on Jerusalem. The UN was kicked out of Gaza and a war broke out. It was a defensive war. We won. International law recognizes occupation as a legal activity. We, as a result of 242, tried to negotiate over many, many years a peace treaty. Up until 1988, they said no 3 times, the famous Khartoum 3 no's. So we are doing nothing wrong in administering Judea and Samaria at the present moment as we talk. Not only that, but the territory that was supposed to become the Jewish national home according to the mandate decision of the League of Nations included Judea and Samaria. It was Transjordan, east of the Jordan, that was taken away, I should say ripped away, and given to a family, again the Hashemites, who came from Saudi Arabia. They were not native to this area. If anybody should be BDSing a power that is illegally occupying territory, it should be Jordan in this area of the world. They have nothing to do with this area. They annexed it in 1950. They told the Arabs of the mandate of Palestine, no state for you, no independence. We gained, they lost everything, unfortunately. We have a right to this land. We have a religious right, we have a legal right, we have a historic right. The only time that Jews did not live in any number in the area which they claim is illegally occupied was the 19 years of Jordanian illegal occupier rule. We were ethnically cleansed from Judea and Samaria starting in 1920. In 1929 in Hebron, Gaza, Nablus, and Jenin. 1936, and then in 1947. We the ones that are suffering from being illegally occupied, illegally thrown out of our homes, violently attacked. All this history is washed away. It doesn't exist for the BDS. If people would know that, I hope that they would turn on BDS and say, you've been telling us a false narrative of what is going on. We have every right to be here. Throughout history we've been here, and I hope as we speak that we will continue to live in the areas of Judea and Samaria, the heartland of the Jewish homeland. One example why the two-state solution, or what I call surrendering or yielding up territory, will not work, can be seen at what happened in Gaza in 2005, the disengagement plan. We left. We withdrew our security forces, our military. We turned about 8,000 Jews out of their homes, and we destroyed their homes in order to achieve peace. You would think that a people that is oppressed or occupied would be very happy and even encourage their brethren in other places to be quiet and peaceful, and eventually a diplomatic resolution, the Israelis, the Jews, will leave. We got terror, we got missiles, we got rockets, we got mortars, we got death. I do not really think, in my personal opinion, that the other side is interested actually in a state. They just don't want us to have a state. They are not really, and I think it's been proven since Oslo, at least since Oslo to 1993, that they're capable of maintaining a political, cultural, social, economic administration over territory. Fatah fights Hamas, Hamas fights Fatah. In between Fatah, you have 6 different factions going on. Mahmoud Abbas hasn't been elected, as we speak at this moment, for 9 years. Where's the democracy? Haven't they learned anything from being in close partnership with Israel about at least how democracy and institutions of government get along? I would hope that they're capable, but maybe they're not interested. Their only goal in being a people, quote unquote, is to make sure that Israel doesn't have a state, its territory is rolled back into a position where once again something will enable them, in their opinion, that's capable of destroying it. Hezbollah is getting stronger in the north, being funded and trained by Iran. You have in the Sinai desert right now elements, we call them Salafi, Al-Qaeda type of elements that are killing the Egyptians and trying to strike at Israel also. Unfortunately, if they get this feeling that they're encircling us, that they may have a advantage over us, and if, God forbid, we give them the hills and mountains of Judea and Samaria where they can look right into the windows of all the high rises on Tel Aviv beachfront, it's too much of an enticement. It's too much of a pull that would say maybe we're able to. I think we would overcome, but at what cost both to us and to the enemy, which will then again revert to a different type of BDS, different type of resolutions being accepted in international forums, which will not solve the problem. I repeat, before 67, there was no occupation and no settlements, Jewish communities, so why did the war break out? What Palestine was the Palestine Liberation Organization trying to liberate when we weren't there in Judea and Samaria and Gaza? None of these BDS people asked that question because it would tell them or force them that the root of the problem has nothing to do with territory. It's an existential element. Do the Jews have the right to exist as a people and not as some sort of religious minority? And do they have the right to what was their historic territory, the homeland? It's a traditional claim by Arabs that they're not anti-Semitic because they're Semitic themselves. And they're not anti-Jews or anti-Jewish in any way because they simply are trying to get back what is theirs. I think this is a false presentation of what really goes on. Anybody who reads the Hamas Charter, it doesn't only talk about Palestine or Israel. It talks about the Jews ruling the world from some protocol of Zion conspiracy theory. They are, especially Hamas, which is now the dominant force. If people think that Mr. Abbas is still sitting strongly on his chair, that's one reason he doesn't have elections, because he doesn't want to let Hamas in. They have an anti-Semitic charter. Has nothing to do with what we do to them. It's what we supposedly are. And when we're not that, you can't fight that. I do not poison wells. And so we see that the pushing force behind the BDS, way down the line, but pushing up, are people who have no respect for history, no respect for the truth. They are anti because they really don't like us. We have succeeded. We have come back from the depths of our exile across Europe, across Asia, across Africa, across the North American continent. We have succeeded. We shouldn't be punished for doing what we were supposed to do. We were supposed to return to Zion and establish a state, and the nations of the world recognize that. We also tried to come peacefully. We are probably the only people in the history of the world that tried to buy back its land from people who illegally occupied it when they invaded in the 7th century, in the throes of some religious revolution coming out of the sands of Arabia, which eventually, I remind you, reached the gates of Vienna and southern France. They did not limit themselves to territory that was theirs. They wanted more. We do not want anybody else's land or territory. We want what's ours, what everybody knows is ours. And so to claim that they're not Jewish, the television programs on the Palestine Authority television channels, on the radio, they're filled with anti-Jewish sentiments. Their denial of Jerusalem as being the capital of the state of Israel, the Temple Mount even existing, or the temple even existing. Yeah, Arafat, I think, went to his grave still trying to claim that on the Temple Mount there was no temple. These are anti-Jewish. These are not anti-Zionist. These are not anti-Israel. They go to the heart because we are Zionists because we're Jewish. We want what's ours. And the nations of the world who throughout history have supported us, restoration movements and Christian Zionism and other matters, they recognize this. And they do, I think, feel in their hearts that they know when you're anti-Israel, at the bottom of it, you're also anti-Jewish. I came to you this morning on a so-called apartheid road. The BDS people claim that there are two sets of highways for Jews and non-Jews in Judea and Samaria. I could show you pictures, and I've put up even video clips of Palestinian Authority cars driving by me all the time. There is no such thing as an apartheid road. There are certain sections less than 2 years ago, less than 10 years ago, that are closed off because of security reasons, because Molotov cocktail firebombs have been thrown, because shooting has happened from olive groves. And it changes. But as an apartheid system, it doesn't exist. We don't have separate water coolers, toilets, bus station stops for two different types of peoples, either colors or nationalities or religions. Our Magen David, our Red Cross vehicle ambulances, they pick up everybody. This is such a blatant falsehood because it hooks up. Going back to what I mentioned before, of saying, well, we successfully fought the real apartheid that was in South Africa through BDS or forms of that. Let's apply it to Israel. And in order to strengthen that, they call Israel's crimes apartheid crimes. Unfortunately, also, we have certain left-wing Israelis in certain newspapers that also promote this theme, this line, apartheid. They don't vote for Israel. That doesn't mean they're apartheid. They vote for the Palestinian Authority. It's not that they don't have a vote. And maybe during a peace agreement in the future, they will be federated with the Jordanian kingdom, which is basically Palestinian itself, because I think about more than 60% of the local population in Jordan has its roots in what was known as the Palestine Mandate, and in fact, they were part of the Palestine Mandate up until 1946. So this issue really gets me angry and upset that people would so blithely go by and say, yes, it's an apartheid regime. What they do is they redefine apartheid. Once upon a time, it meant you couldn't vote. Now it means that we don't give you a solution so you can vote for your own. You can vote for your country. It's your responsibility to make peace with Israel. It's not our responsibility. You were the ones who opened the war. You were the ones, not only apartheid, you wanted to erase us. You wanted to eradicate us. What was the theme then? Some of us are old enough to remember, throw the Jews into the sea. That's worse than apartheid. So I really don't appreciate what they are doing to the language in this linguistic semantic war that we also face. The local Arab population do not want to move into Palestine. What they want to do in growing numbers is gain something they call an ethnic autonomous regime, especially in the Galil, in the Galilee. The invidious propaganda themes are moving across the border very easily today. And we see that in the behavior of most of the Arab members of the Knesset. Some of them joining BDS movements, like actions like the flotilla. And yet they have Knesset immunity, and so we are very liberal in our society, and we tolerate this. But it is working on. So when I came here to this country the first time back in 1966, I knew and met and even lived among, for a short time, Arab Israelis, or Israeli Arabs. Now I'm living with and together with Palestinians who possess Israeli citizenship. They're not even Arabs anymore. So one of the contras to this happened to be Christian Arabs. We have a priest in Nazareth, I think his first name is Medad, if I'm not mistaken, who's trying to get Christian Arabs to enter the Israeli army in order to, like the Druze, to better fit into Israeli society and be Israeli. You don't have to be Jewish to be Israeli, and you don't really have to be Jewish to be a Zionist. But you have to believe in so that the Jews are a people and have a right to a state. That the Arab population that is Muslim mainly has a conflict over. I cannot give you the percentages of how much are radical and how much are basically sit put, but it's having its effect. And it's not a healthy situation, certainly not for Israel, and certainly not for their own population, who has the opportunity to go to universities, has the opportunity to make advances in life, who has a possibility to be doctors and lawyers, which they don't have in other places. And we would like to see the situation get better and not get worse. They say that our age is an age of information, unlimited. With Google and the internet, the ability to search and get information has expanded totally. And yet, if you are ideologically committed, you are very narrow-framed. Liberals will read the New York Review of Books, or less liberal, but not quite conservative, will read the New Republic. I'm talking to an American audience here. There's the London Review of Books. It's a similar situation. And that's it. You don't take advantage of the liberty and freedom given to you to make a true research project of what you believe in. And I don't know if it's foolishness. You are given, students today especially, are given the ability to challenge their professors in no ways that we could even think of at our age. And yet, from my reading the situation, the professors are dominating the college scene and rigorously putting them into corners and even threatening them that they have to go along with certain ideological persuasions, and BDS is riding this. You go into a lot, or should I say too many, college, university departments today, especially in the Middle East, okay? And they're dominated by Israelis who left this country and are not that sympathetic anymore, left-wing professors, and people who come in originally from Arab Middle East countries, who are fitting into a rainbow coalition, Native Indian rights, Afro-American. They infiltrate and then simply move everything over onto a frame of BDS to Israel. Is no different from what other campaigns you've been involved in. The portrayal is wrong, it's out of proportion, and kids, I can only make the conclusion, I'm not going to say they're not intelligent, I'll use they're not smart enough to grasp and take advantage of the books and resources available to them to listen to the message coming out of Israel and the supporters of Israel, that we are right, we are just, we are correct. Our administration of and living in Judea and Samaria is correct and true. And we are not doing any harm to any person who's not doing harm to us. And that everybody could benefit from our presence in this area. And certainly for security measures, we cannot, even if we arrange for a different type of administration, our military oversee of this area cannot be yielded. Otherwise, we will fall, or we will begin to fail. And if that happens, the Western world is not far behind, given the development of ISIS, ISIL, Daesh, all these other. This is the wave of the future. You have Americans and Europeans volunteering in these groups to be suicide bombers. United States forces have already killed Americans who have joined these terrorist regimes. This is not theory. This is not a dispute in a college classroom. This is happening. Blood is being shed. We don't want it to happen to Israel. We want the BDS movement to stop, the people to realize they're doing something wrong, and to begin to do something right. What I do know, rather than think, is that there's a tremendous link between university, research facilities, institutions on and off campus, and many foreign funding sources, specifically from oil-rich countries. Once universities get into such a lock-in, it's very difficult to refuse a $5 million grant, which usually means sponsor one of our people as one of your assistant professors in the department, and within 5 years he's a professor. Is it strategically planned? I think on lower levels, yes. I think people sit down and say, how can we do this, and not step into it. Regarding research, I think they did step into it. Wikipedia is probably the worst enemy of critical thinking on campuses today. No one reads books anymore. They go to Wikipedia. Wikipedia looks very good, and it has usually sources down the bottom. But out of 10 books against, they'll have perhaps sometimes the one book against. And so what's there, I'm not in the States anymore, but I see a little bit of it. Everybody takes their smartphones to school or their tablets. They don't open textbooks like we used to do. And so it's a different situation. I think it's dumbing down, if I may use the phrase, good minds and getting them to go the easy way, which then facilitates something among many other issues, not only BDS against Israel, because you can't open up to everything. And in this situation, I do think that if there's a wrongdoing on college campuses, it's the administration that are getting themselves hooked into deals and contracts they can't get out of. It has a long-term effect on who's teaching, what's being taught, what are the books from which will be taught from, and this is feeding the BDS even more. We know the whole issue of the Palestine Authority textbooks is a classic case of how you can turn a population away from peace and to continue on terror and right of return and no recognition of Israel through the textbooks. And college students around the world are also being subjected in different levels and different amounts to the same type of approach. The grassroots campaigning of fighting back on BDS is an example of what real freedom of the individual is and what American democracy really, truly means as a philosophy for the world. That a citizen can make his decision and take a fight through democratic means, through education, through advertising, through political talk, through affecting government in the best tradition of what American Judeo-Christian values really mean. That when pressed, you have the ability. When threatened, you have the forces at hand to combat that. Not to take it lying down, not to yield. American traditions, which are based to a certain extent on Hebraic sources in terms of what government really is and the individual responsibility, is able to combat evil and wrong and untruths, which is what I think in this specific case we're facing in BDS, which doesn't have only ramifications for Israel, but for Jews and for their supporters, and eventually for those people who think they're in a democracy but are being undermined from within. This is a classic case of coming out of darkness into light.